Hello guys. Today I will introduce you to the POCO X5 5G. This is a new mid-range model that will probably be followed by a Pro and GT version. The mid-range at POCO are generally fairly complete phones without much innovation. The latest POCO phones are also largely inspired by the Redmi Note range, so they haven't brought anything new, but that's not a big deal. That's not where POCO wants to stand out. This new POCO takes up features from the previous generation, with in particular a Snapdragon 695 used on the POCO X4 Pro. There is also the Samsung 50 million pixel photo sensor from the POCO M5. The first visible novelty is its external appearance. The POCO X5 is thinner than the previous generation. The back has a uniform metallic effect surface with just a rectangular block to house the three photo sensors. Let's see together what this new generation of POCO X has in store for us. POCO is a brand that has tried many things with all the models they have launched in recent years, but there is one thing that is stable over time, and that is the packaging. Here we find the black box, its yellow lettering, its yellow packaging which contains the documentation and a transparent soft silicone shell, the telephone protected by a plastic film, a 33 watts charger and its USB cable. I was a little surprised to find a 33-watt charger. It's more or less what POCO was offering in its third-generation phones. POCO tends to produce quite thick and bulky phones, but the first thing that struck me with this phone was its lightness. It weighs 190 grams. It's still a lot of weight compared to some other models, but if that's the first feeling I had when taking it in hand, it's that there's a difference with what I'm used to. The POCO X5 is also thinner than previous models, and this without sacrificing battery size. I tested the anthracite grey model. I don't know if other colors will be available. This color gives it a smooth metallic effect, quite successful. Below we find the usual USB-C port with a sound sensor and an audio output. This audio output is also the only one, and it's quite surprising because most phones in this price range have two outputs to produce stereo sound. At the top we find the usual infrared port, a sound sensor and a jack-type headphone output. On the right side we find the volume buttons and the power button, which also serves as a fingerprint sensor. These buttons are located more or less at the same height as most phones. On the back there is an imposing photo sensor that comes out slightly from the back of the phone. This photo block is made up of two sensors, wide-angle and ultra-wide-angle, an extra sensor, accessible with GAM, and a LED flash. The screen is just interrupted by a selfie sensor in the form of a punch in the middle of the screen. This one is a bit smaller than what I'm used to seeing in this price range. The screen is protected by a plastic film placed at the factory, so you won't have to stick it yourself. The SIM drawer can hold two SIM cards and a memory card. It is accessible on the left side of the phone in the usual place. The borders are quite similar to the previous generation of POCO. It is very likely that this screen has already been used on a model prior to this one. This POCO X5 does not bring a revolution in terms of its finish or its aesthetics. We are very far from the gamer design of the X3, but that is not a bad thing. The X5 is more consensual and will undoubtedly appeal to a wider audience. It is a sober and elegant phone that has its place in the mid-range POCO. The POCO X5 takes up the architecture of the POCO X4 Pro with its Qualcomm Snapdragon 695 CPU and its Adreno 619 GPU. The choice of this architecture implies that these two phones have the same level of performance and also share the same hardware for Wi-Fi, the Bluetooth and GPS. Nothing new here, but it's not a big problem in itself as long as everything works correctly. This configuration offers a good level of performance in this price range. I obtained a score of 325,000 points on Antutu. This score puts this phone at the level of a Google Pixel 5 or just below a Redmi Note 11 Pro Plus. Even though this phone is not a gamer's phone, you should be able to play many games without sacrificing anything. I will come back to this point later in this video. To test the battery range, I use an application that I developed which consumes about 10% of the phone's resources. I then let the phone run until it runs out, measuring the battery percentage every minute. I do a test with the brightness at 100% and another with the brightness at 50%. The POCO X5 uses the same type of battery as the POCO X4 Pro, but I noticed differences in performance. The first visible difference is the charging time. The X5 has a fast charge of 33 watts where the X4 Pro goes up to 67 watts. The battery charging time is therefore inevitably longer. I measured a charging time of 228 minutes with my Ugreen 100-watt charger. This either means that this phone is not compatible with the charging standard or that it is not very fast in charging. This graph shows the charging evolution, and as you can see, it is perfectly linear. It is very rare, it doesn't slow down in the last 20%. I measured the POCO X5 battery range under the same conditions as the POCO X4 Pro, and here too I obtained a slightly different result with a shorter battery range for the POCO X5. I got 493 minutes of battery life with 100% brightness and 1058 minutes with 50% brightness. The consumption of the screen is therefore perfectly linear because the autonomy is almost divided by 2 with 100% brightness. I looked at the consumption of each component of the phone in detail, and I do not see a major difference between the X5 and the X4 Pro. So the battery is less efficient, or maybe I was unlucky in the battery lottery. To test the energy performance of a phone, I put it through a load test that pushes its components to the maximum for several minutes at a time. I can thus measure the consumption of each component individually, but also the ability of the phone to manage the use of all the components at the same time. This test also allows me to see if the phone manages to properly dissipate the heat. I get scores quite similar to what I got with the POCO X4 Pro. When the CPU is pushed to the maximum, I have an average consumption of 4.26 watts. For the GPU, I obtain 2.29 watts under the same conditions. With all the components used at the same time, I observe a very moderate rise in temperature of the battery with an average of only 26 degrees Celsius over more than 7 minutes of testing without interruption. From these measured values, the POCO X5 ranks in the average. It is neither excellent nor bad, it is just average. The POCO X5 is equipped with a 48 million pixel Samsung S5 KJN1 sensor as the main sensor. I have already tested this sensor on POCO M5, Redmi 10, TCL 30 SE and POCO M4 Pro. It is usually available in a 50 million pixel version, while it produces 48 million pixels on this POCO X5. It is most likely the same sensor with perhaps a different configuration. In any case, I find it a shame that POCO chooses a sensor of this type for the mid-range, because it is a sensor that is usually reserved for entry-level phones. The second sensor is an OmniVision ultra-wide-angle sensor. There is a third sensor on the phone, but this is not accessible from the photo application. It is there to assist the other two. I see it appear in the list of sensors with the Gcam photo application. This application also works very well on this POCO. Let's start the photo quality analysis with the main sensor. It is a 48 million pixel Samsung S5 KJN1. I tested this camera on a sunny winter day, but sometimes the sun's rays were completely blocked by clouds. These are interesting conditions for testing a camera. When the sun is shining, the photos are of good quality with good color balance, good exposure and good sharpness. The dynamic range, on the other hand, is not very high, because even when the sun is shining, the darkest areas of the photo are darker than they should be. This is even more visible when the cloud cover is more important. Photos are often underexposed and you quickly see the limitations of this sensor. I also took pictures with the Gcam app to see if photo processing of this app would improve the photo, but it's not the case. Photos taken with Gcam are too warm, they're easy to recognize. Now let's move on to the secondary sensor. It is an 8 million pixel OmniVision OV08D10. This secondary sensor from OmniVision is ultra-wide angle, and it generally produces lower quality photos than the main sensor. Under identical conditions, this sensor will produce less bright photos than the Samsung one. The dynamic range is also more limited. This will therefore lead to areas that are too dark or too bright as soon as the light conditions are no longer ideal. The sharpness is also less good. It is not visible on a phone screen, but if you look at your photos on a computer screen, you will quickly see that the edges are not sharp. These results are not surprising at all. It is the same for the vast majority of ultra-wide-angle sensors. The POCO X5 has a night mode on the default photo app, and it also works with the night mode of the Gcam app. I will show you sample photos taken with both apps. The first set of photos were taken with the default photo app, and the second set was taken by Gcam. Night mode photos allow you to capture scenes in a partially lit environment with great ease, but you also have to understand the limitations of it. Exposure time is reduced to avoid blurry photos, but this is done at the cost of an increase in ISO. On a phone screen it is not very visible, but in the dark, digital noise is quite visible. It is not as well managed as what I have seen on other phones. The other point that should be noted is that the foreground often benefits from a sharpening treatment which will improve the rendering, but it is the opposite with the background, where the details are smoothed and there is a fairly visible loss of quality if you zoom into the photo. The POCO X5 is not the phone of the year for night photography, but it is still very correct. Most users undoubtedly have occasional use of night mode, and for this, the POCO fulfills its mission perfectly. For more demanding users, I would recommend other phones. This phone is capable of filming in 1080p with 30 frames per second, which is quite common in this price range. The video quality is not extraordinary because the sensor is quickly challenged when the light decreases. I recorded this video on a cloudy day and you can see for yourselves that this video is too dark. Focusing is fast but noticeable. I see micro adjustments with every movement. The dynamic range is not very high because we clearly see areas of underexposure or the opposite depending on the orientation of the phone. I had already made these remarks for the photo part of this test, but these remarks are even more visible for the video. The POCO X5 does not have a night mode for video. The result is therefore quite average because digital noise is very visible, the video is very grainy. The phone also struggles to find focus. It tries to establish its focus with every movement, and therefore the details of the video are not very sharp. Night video remains a challenge for most phones. It is generally necessary to move towards the high end to hope to obtain a quality result. I was expecting this phone to be able to stabilize 1080p video, but this is not quite the case. As you can see in this video, the shock of walking is not fully dampened, so the video is shaken with every step. This phone is good enough to handle stabilization, but it's probably the sensor here that doesn't offer it. To obtain excellent color accuracy with this phone, you must select the standard mode in the screen settings. With the standard mode, I get a delta E of 1:38. It's an excellent level of color accuracy. The color space is also greater than 100% of Rec. 709, which will further enhance image quality. The colors are accurate, but so is the white. I measured a temperature of 6411 Kelvin, so here we are very close to the ideal measurement with 6500 Kelvin. The image is neither too hot nor too cold. After the colors, I measured the brightness and got a brightness of 408 candela per square meter in normal mode, and by activating the sun mode I went up to 640 candela per square meter. This is a very good level of brightness that will allow you to use this phone outdoors, provided you use the sun mode. The contrast is excellent with an almost infinite depth of blacks. The POCO X5 screen is a very good and can compete with more expensive phones. I just notice a variation of colors when looking at the screen from the sides, but I think this effect is caused by the screen protection. The POCO X5 is powerful enough to run PUBG Mobile in good conditions. The level of detail is good and we can see the details of the scenery from quite a distance, since from the plane, the trees on the ground are visible. The gaming experience is good. I didn't encounter any jerkiness or slowdowns. The textures load gradually but fast enough not to have empty areas while moving the character. The POCO X5 offers sufficient performance to play any game in good conditions. Some games more demanding than PUBG Mobile may require an adaptation of the level of detail, but for a phone in this price range, it will be suitable for a very large audience. What I suspected when unpacking the phone is true here. However, the sound only comes out of the speaker at the bottom of the phone. This reduces the immersive side of the game, and as long as your hand is positioned on the speaker, you will not hear anything. The PUBG Mobile video takes several minutes. If you are not interested in this section, I invite you to skip to the next sequence. I got an accuracy level of 3 meters and average satellite coverage. I also checked the actual positioning against the reported level of accuracy, and I actually end up about 3 meters from where I was for testing. That's a typical level of accuracy for this kind of phone, but don't worry about 3 meters, as GPS apps are usually able to get you back on the road. Just for hikers, this might be a problem. I don't have 5G network at home, so I can only test the sensitivity to the 4G network. To assess signal sensitivity, I implemented a probe that has measured the network signal under the same conditions every minute, 24 hours a day for more than 2 years. I measure phone performance by placing it next to the probe and comparing signals. As I have tested many phones with this protocol, I have a reliable basis for comparison. I performed over 2,000 measurements to assess 4G sensitivity and obtained an average signal of -99 dBm. Over the same period, I obtained an average signal of -92.3 dBm with the probe. The difference is quite significant, which indicates that the POCO X5 has a below the average network sensitivity. It's clearly not the worst phone I've tested, but it will end up quite low in the rankings. If you live in an area with poor network coverage, this phone may not be for you. To measure Wi-Fi sensitivity, I use my test application to measure the evolution of the signal over time by always placing the phones in the same conditions. I am doing a test near my router and a remote one. I obtained an average signal of -17 dBm near the router and an average signal of -64 dBm at a distance. This places this phone in the good average of the ranking. I got a link speed of 433 megabits per second in 5 GHz and 72 megabits per second in 2.4 GHz. These are values that have become standard in the mid-range, and if your connection allows it, you will be able to reach sufficient speeds to watch movies in 4K streaming or downloading large files. I tested the audio quality for music with the external speaker as well as with a headset. I also tested the audio quality in calls with the listening speaker and the external speaker. The POCO X5 is equipped with a single speaker located on the lower part of the phone, so it starts with a deficit compared to previous generations which produce stereo sound. It's quite a shame because sound propagation is less good and the overall volume is affected depending on the position of the phone. The sound produced is correct and quite comparable to what is done in this price range. POCO reproduces the sound correctly on call. The quality is good with a balance between low and high frequencies. Call volume is slightly above average. If I switch to speakerphone mode, this phone goes to a fairly loud sound level for a phone of this type. It is clearly above average here without a big degradation in sound quality.
For English, press 1. Voor Nederlands, toets 2. Pour le français, appuyez sur le 3. Für Deutsch, drücken Sie die 4. For English, press 1 pour Nederlands, toets 2 pour le français, appuyez sur le 3. Für Deutsch, drücken Sie die 4. For English, press 1 pour Nederlands, toets 2 pour le français, appuyez sur le 3. Für Deutsch, drücken Sie die 4. Au revoir.
The POCO X5 is able to reproduce most frequencies quite faithfully, and it does it quite well. The low frequencies are very close to the reference, and the dropout of the high frequencies is quite minimal, 0.2 decibels. The volume is average and the sound does not suffer from distortion even if the volume is pushed to the maximum. If you are familiar with Xiaomi phones, you will not be out of place at all. The MIUI interface is rich in features. It allows you to go further than the native Android interface, but with the number of possibilities, you might need a little time to adapt. The usual criticisms are still relevant, including the presence of advertising or the use of antivirus after downloading an application, but that has never bothered me. I noticed two changes compared to the last POCO I tested. There is the association of the Start button with Google Assistant. It's annoying if you don't use Google Assistant. You have to keep your finger longer on the button to turn off the phone. The other point that bothered me is the presence of this little waiting animation displayed between two actions on the phone. I had seen this animation for the first time on the POCO M5, and it is the case again on this POCO. The performance of this phone should make it possible not to go through a waiting animation, so I don't understand this choice. I use many criteria to evaluate a phone in order to provide you with as complete information as possible. I suppose these criteria are not of equal importance for you, so you will have to select what is important to you because the ideal phone does not exist. Who is this POCO X5 aimed at? We are here clearly on a mass-market phone for a large audience. You have to see the POCO X5 as a versatile student who is neither first nor last in the class. If I have to sum up the qualities of this phone, I would say that it has an excellent screen, good battery range, good performance, good sound quality with headphones, good heat dissipation, nice design, and good Wi-Fi and GPS signal. The photo and video quality is okay when the light conditions are good, but I will not remember this phone as a reference for photo quality. On most of the evaluation criteria, this phone obtains an average score. Details of each test are available on my blog. Now let's review its weaknesses. Unfortunately, this phone does not only have qualities. It has some weaknesses, sometimes technical ones, sometimes related to its price positioning. The biggest weakness is its average sensitivity to the network, and this is not the first time that I have noticed this kind of problem with POCO. It was also the case with the POCO X3. Then this phone only has one external speaker. It's a throwback, and in this price range it's not very common in POCO. Charging speed is also down. The X4 Pro was twice as fast. And finally, there is also this little waiting animation that appeared on the latest version of MIUI. This phone is fast enough to be able to do without a waiting animation, so I don't really understand this choice. So, I hope my test answered your questions. If not, ask them in the comments. If you liked my test, don't forget to subscribe or buy your products from my links. Thank you for your attention and see you soon for a new test.